Hey, what's up, everyone? Well, we are going way back in time on the Sons of History podcast. We are going into the Assyrian Empire. That is many moons ago, wouldn't you say, Dr. Allen?
Yes, Dr. Dustin. We're talking about Jonah and the whale. You know, the Assyrians. Come on, they were the badasses of the Mesopotamian region. So they kicked some ass until they eventually got wiped out. So there you go.
Yep. And well, I wouldn't say it all went down from there. It went down for them, for sure. And the rise of other empires. It's sort of your first empire that really gets credit. I guess you would call you would say it's the Egyptians. Now let me ask: would you say the Egyptians were the first empire, but it really doesn't count because it's not in the Mesopotamian area? It's you're in uh, northern Africa.
Well, the Egyptians. I didn't study the Egyptians as much as some of the others, but I don't recall them crossing across the Sinai and into the Near East or Middle East area. So I don't know if you would want to count that. The Assyrians, on the other hand, the Assyrians they went far and wide,
Yeah,
as did the Babylonians, and then even the Persian Empire went into Egypt. The,
right.
the Persian Empire went not only, they were in Asia, Africa, and in Europe at one point. And I don't know if before, I know that Alexander's, his empire stretched all three continents also, but I think it was, I know the Babylonians were in Egypt, at least I think they were. I need to read up a little bit more on them. But yeah, the Assyrian Empire was considered, I believe, the first empire.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, we're going to discuss that with our guest, Mark Healy, who has written a book on the Assyrian empires. But before we get to that, ladies and gentlemen, if you didn't listen to our last episode, this is the last season of the podcast. Alan, you want to say anything? Don't be a loser.
Now you already opened the let the cat out of the bag in the last one. So, but yes, this is not the end of the Sons of History. It just means that we're going to be moving into other projects. So,
Exactly. Yeah. But the podcast is coming to an end, or yeah, it's coming to an end after this season. Well, ladies and gentlemen, while you dry your eyes, can you do us a favor and subscribe to our YouTube channel or to our podcast wherever you're listening? No, it's not too late to subscribe. It's not too late to leave a comment and click the like button. No, it's not too late to leave a nice 5-star rating and a glowing review. Never too late. Never surrender. Never say die. Never give up. Uh,
I can see people giving us 1 stars right now,
I
based on
know.
that little rant. I do want to say that if you do subscribe or like us or follow us, we have heard from some people who stated that they're not getting any notifications. So I'm gonna state, keep checking our site. We have new material coming out. Dustin, I know you've written a lot of material, a lot more than I have, by the way. But Dustin's written some incredible stories. And if you want to learn various subjects, visit our site on Facebook, visit our site on YouTube, and you'll get more information on things that for some reason Facebook and YouTube have just decided we're not going to notify anybody that we have new material. So keep checking our sites.
It's been a real uphill battle for sure. But it is what it is, and there's not much you can do about it except complain and
Yeah, and complaining to the people who are doing it's not going to do us any
rend
good.
your clothes, rend your garments. That's it. Um, you know, this is going to be the first time that we've ever had a discussion on the Assyrians on this show. We have discussed the ancient Greeks numerous times. We've discussed the Romans. Um, I don't know if we've ever gone this as far back as the Assyrians. I don't even think we've ever had a conversation on the Egyptians or even the Jews of ancient Israel or anything like that. So I think this is as far back as we will have ever gone on the show, which is pretty freaking far back. So.
Well, the various Mesopotamian empires stretched back to, you're talking about like 2500 BC, 2200 BC. The Code of Hammurabi was written. You know what? Yeah, about 2250 BC. So yeah, that's further back from the birth of Christ than where we are.
Then forward.
Yeah. So you're talking about let's say if the birth of Christ is around 1 AD, which I still think it's 4 BC, but 2250 BC versus what are we 2023? So we still got another 200 years to go before that time period from Hammurabi to Jesus to us.
Yep.
That's kind of that's weird to think about. You going that far back.
Yeah. Man, what wild times. Well, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we're going to bring on our guest. His name is Mark Healy. His education is in theology, philosophy, and politics. His first book, Warriors of the Old Testament, was published in 1990. Now, he's written extensively on military subjects of the ancient worlds of Egypt, Assyria, and Rome, all the way up to the modern world, specifically World War II. Now, his specialties on World War II history are on German armor, U-boats, and the Luftwaffe. And we will be talking...
Luftwaffe.
Hey, man, I'm not German. We will be talking with him about his latest book, The Ancient Assyrians, Empire and Army 883 to 612 BC. Ladies and gentlemen, I can guarantee you that you're going to enjoy this conversation. I already know it. It's almost like I can remember it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've got Mark on the line. Mark, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Dustin.
Well, you're very welcome. It is great to have you. I know that you are out in the UK. Whereabouts are you?
Well, I'm to the southwest of London, on the south coast, in a little town called Wimborne, which is near a place called Bournemouth. I call it a town. I think you would call it a city.
Well, yeah, I mean, we are. You never know because we are on.
How far is that from Southampton?
Oh, it's about 25, 28 miles. Okay. So you know Southampton, do you?
Yes, I've been to that region several times. So I know Southampton, and then going east to go. I was reading on King William the First, and then I guess not too far from you is also Stonehenge. So you're in a.
Oh yeah, it's about 30 miles to the northeast.
Uh-huh. I'm surprised you're using the word miles. I thought you Brits like the word kilometers.
Well, you have to understand, I'm getting on a bit. I'm 70. Uh-huh. So throughout all my life, I've used miles. When we went into the EU, in theory, in 72, we changed over to kilometers, but I think most people in this country still are quite happy with miles.
What? That's good to hear. Now, if we can just get you guys to drive on the other side of the road, everything will be better for everybody.
There are too many other places that have learnt to drive on our side of the road because they were part of the empire.
Well, that's actually, I learned how to drive that way when I was in Barbados. So when I was in Australia, it was very easy for me to drive throughout the country. So,
yeah, Alan has been a little bit of everywhere, as is made known that he is, acquainted with Southampton and Stonehenge, which we're still trying to figure out how those stones got put together. But, Alan.
I think everybody is.
Yeah. My guess is strongman competition went a little haywire. So that's
Indeed.
my guess. All right. Mark, it's going to be a fun and fabulous conversation, I can already tell, because it's the Assyrians, and we have actually never had a conversation on this program about the Assyrians. We are nearing our 200th episode, and it's never happened. So, congratulations to you for bringing us on board with the Ancient Assyrians. Now, my first question, I sort of want to tie two questions together about the information that we have on the Assyrians that come from archaeology. What are some of the major artifacts, like the reliefs and cuneiforms, that have informed us about the Assyrians? And I believe that you wrote your first book about 30 years ago. What has been discovered about the Assyrians since then?
Well, certainly a lot has been discovered about the Assyrians since then, which is what prompted me to approach Osprey to write another and bigger book. My interest in the Assyrians has always been primarily from the military point of view. I've written quite a few books on military history, both ancient and modern. My academic background is theology and philosophy, and it was in the course of doing Old Testament studies for my first degree that I came across the Assyrians, and the bug bit, and I've taken an interest in them ever since. I think we're rather lucky in the amount of information that's come down to us through cuneiform tablets, which you've mentioned. Of course, all the other information that went down on pieces of leather and papyrus, well, they have disintegrated over time. So it's only on the cuneiform texts that we have information. But thank goodness, the Assyrian kings were very vociferous in describing their military campaigns and a whole host of other aspects of Assyrian life. There's another book out at the moment by the head of Assyriology, I think, at Chicago University, Eckhart Fromm, which actually looks at Assyria in the wider context than I have done, because my focus was essentially on the empire and the military. So the culture, for which there was no space in my writing, can be looked at there. So employing the two books alongside each other would give people who don't know much about the Assyrians, I think, a very, very good basic primer on the Assyrian Empire.
And when it comes to since your book, has there been any great discoveries on the Assyrians in the past 30 years?
Well, I think it's new information that has arisen in consequence of academics translating the cuneiform and expanding on the information that's already known. It is really quite surprising just how much is known. But of course, the Assyrians aren't a topic most people are familiar with. That they were responsible for creating probably the world's first empire, in the sense in which we understand that term, seems to have sort of bypassed people. I think also it is unfortunate that, and again, I think this is probably because of the Bible and the influence of Western culture, the Assyrians have always been seen in a very pejorative light. They have a reputation for barbarity, which is deserved in cases, but they're not alone in being barbarous. So it may well be that in consequence of the information that's now coming out and the books that are coming out, people will actually bother to acquire a deeper understanding of these people and this culture. They were quite remarkable.
You know, I got to tell you that I've always viewed the Assyrians as badasses. I first learned about them, the story of Jonah, for instance. He had to go to Nineveh and tell the people living there that they'd better, shape up or they're dead. And I know Jonah didn't Jonah was like wanting them to get wiped out. I know that, and I myself, I read a little bit about the Assyrians, and and then what really got me to be like, all right, I want to find out who these Assyrians were. I'm assuming you've seen the Monty Python movie, the Quest for the Holy Grail. Have you seen that one?
Yes, indeed.
You remember that the first guy? Okay, that first guy. I don't remember which one he was, Sir Robin or someone. The third question was, what is the capital of Nineveh or capital of Assyria? And he's like, I don't know, and I knew that one. I knew that one. So I read up on it.
It depends when, even in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the capital went from Ashur, then it went to Kalhu or Nimrud, and then it went to Khorsabad, and then it went to Nineveh, Nineveh being the final capital under Ashurbanipal.
Okay, see, Nineveh would have been the one I would have answered. So maybe I would have survived and was able to cross the bridge. So the question I have is that in your reference in your book you do reference the ancient scriptures of the Old Testament. So how accurate is the Old Testament when it comes to the history of the Assyrians?
From my point of view, we have to depart from the premise that when you look at books in the Old Testament, which are called history books, they're not history in the way that we understand it. They are the use of history for theological reasons. It is the theology that underpins what is being written about that accounts for how the history is being employed. So we have a problem here because I think certainly in America, from what I understand, and what I know, because I've only been to America once. I went in 2010, and I stayed with my former philosophy tutor, who was then a professor of theology at the Southwestern Methodist University in Dallas. And he was a leading light in the Methodist tradition over there. And I do know that for the nonconformist tradition in America, it is still understood that the Bible is meant to be taken fairly literally. Am I right?
You're right.
Yeah, which leads us into all sorts of problems because I don't believe the Bible is the literal word of God. To go to the Bible and look for history is really to not use the Bible properly. The people who wrote the books that we see in the Old Testament, which has information in there about the Assyrians are being used for theological purposes. For example, Yahweh says, Assyria, the rod of mine anger. It's fitting into Jewish covenant theology. It isn't history, which is why when I did the treatment of Sennacherib's invasion of Judah in 701 BC, you don't get an account that tends to read much like what one finds in the Bible. Whereas the Old Testament books treat Sennacherib's, his invasion and subsequent defeat. I have grave doubts it was a defeat. Certainly the Assyrian texts which describe the campaign in Judah, they give no suggestion whatsoever that it's a defeat. And some of the claims in the Bible as to how many Assyrians that the angel of the Lord destroyed in one night, which then accounts for why the siege of Jerusalem was raised and the Assyrians retreated back to Nineveh with their tail between their legs, just isn't credible. I come back to the point I've already made. I think it is simply wrong to treat the Old Testament books, which are theological, as history as we understand it.
I'm going to have to disagree with my co-host. I do see the New Testament, with the exception of maybe Revelations, that you have to take it literally. But I myself never took the Old Testament as being literal for a variety of reasons. But that's going to be a different story. I did, however, when I read about, say, the angel of the Lord wiping out I don't know. I thought I read something like 100,000 Assyrians. For me, I looked at it as
Went up as high as about 180,000 overnight.
something like that. Yeah. And so I just looked at that. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, if one is assuming it's a factual account, it's frankly incredible and not possible. I hoped I point that out in my book. I mean, the Assyrian army was fighting fully fledged in Babylonia the following year. And although the Assyrians had probably manpower larger than most other powers in the ancient Near East at the time, they couldn't have lost 183,000 soldiers overnight and then survived as an empire. So I think one has to see those sorts of accounts as ways of strengthening the theological view of the power of the Lord in terms of his mighty actions. You shouldn't look at it as if it's literal history. If people do, then they have problems, I think.
Well, for me, I looked at it as that maybe there was some sort of a pestilence or some disease that ravaged their camp and killed.
But why would you need to think that?
Why? Well, if you read some of the books from that period, if a volcano destroyed an entire area, it was because Hephaestus was mad at the people, or if lightning, a storm, well, it's because God was mad at them. So, they didn't have the science that we have today, where you have satellites and you can see things. So, anytime something bad happened, they blamed it on something supernatural. They blamed it on God. God was angry at you. God was this. God was that. Which I don't think God's going to waste his time and sit and wipe out somebody simply because you ate some kind of meat that you weren't supposed to on a Friday. So that's why. But even reading some of the Greek sources, the Greeks themselves, when something bad happened, it was because Hera was mad or Zeus was mad. So that's why I came to that conclusion. I mean, even in the beginning of the Iliad, there was Apollo was wiping out much of Agamemnon's army. So right there, you have an instance where Apollo is pissed off and he's killing much of the Greek army. So when I read that in the Old Testament, that was my same thought, that instead of it being Apollo, it was Jehovah. So,
but you have a problem because in the Assyrian texts, you don't have a siege of Jerusalem. You have a siege of Lachish, but you do not have a siege of Jerusalem. The Akkadian terms that are used to describe what the Assyrians did around Jerusalem is that they blockaded it. They didn't lay siege to it. And given that the Assyrians knew full well that the wall defenses of Jerusalem were pretty formidable because they were made of stone, thick stone. I mean, the walls of Lachish were 15 foot thick. Now, when the Assyrians had laid siege to capitals of other polities that they had attacked, in some cases, they were laying siege to some of these places for up to 3 years. Jerusalem would not have fallen in the time that the Assyrians were fighting in Judah, which was one campaign season. That is from the time the ending of the harvest towards perhaps the end of October. That's why Lachish was laid siege to. It was a symbolic destruction of a city of the Judeans. Jerusalem wasn't attacked in the sense of it was laid siege to with a view to taking the city. That you have this account in the Bible that suggests it has to do with the way the Bible was written. It's not history. I mean, I go so far as to say people seem to want to bend over backwards to try and account for why the Assyrians did this and did that according to what the Bible says. But here is something that maybe might shock some of your listeners who perhaps do view the Bible in the particular way we're talking about. That quite simply, there was no siege of Jerusalem. Quite simply, there was no destruction of Assyrian soldiers of the sort that's described in the text, the scriptures themselves. We have a very different view which reflects Jewish theology, not history, as history being what actually happened.
No, I mean, I was so. In your opinion, did the story of Jonah, was that a true story, or?
Jonah is not meant to be taken literally as literal truth. It's okay. More. It falls into a section of Jewish religious writings, which has to do with prediction, whatever. Nineveh didn't fall because of Jonah. Nineveh fell because of the Babylonians and the Medes in 612. I'm afraid, gentlemen, I'm far more skeptical, perhaps, than maybe I'm hearing you suggest you are about the biblical texts.
Oh, it's no problem. When I look at now the Old Testament, I see it as sort of how you are referencing it, from a theological sort of propagandish perspective, that is a light hold on history, but is very in favor, and you sort of make this point in your book, very in favor of one side, which would be the Jewish side.
Which of course it is. It would be, because that's what they were writing for.
And to your point with that, also the Assyrians, and I think most empires, at least, for a vast long period of time, nobody really wrote about their defeats. Nobody really wrote about their embarrassments, and a lot of people weren't even allowed to write about their embarrassments. So you have a little bit of propaganda from every angle, I would say.
Oh, yes. I think without doubt, the cuneiform writings of the various kings in which they describe their campaigns, which actually forms the substance of what is to be found on most of the main cuneiform texts that they produced, were about victories. But it is also generally accepted that they were pretty victorious most of the time. They did suffer defeats. I mean, the Romans suffered defeats. The Romans suffered terrible defeats. And I think, what was it, President Kennedy? I can't remember exactly. Everybody claims victory, but defeat is an orphan child. So yes, the Assyrians were defeated on occasions, but on the whole, they tended to be victorious.
Yeah,
and that was because they were a militarist state and they had a very efficient army.
Yeah, they. I mean, I've seen the maps of what the Assyrians, how big their empire was. I was quite impressed. The funny thing is that it seemed like it was always a back and forth. You had, you had the Babylonians, you had the Assyrians, and there were in some regions from what is today Iran, where they were going back and forth, great empires until you said 612. Where several armies kind of gathered together and finally wiped out Assyria. I want to mention some of the leaders of Assyria. I'm familiar with Sargon II. Can you give our listeners a brief rundown of some of the great kings of Assyria and some that were not, and what was so great about them and some of their achievements?
Well, I think the use of the term great is, in this context, has to do with the idea that there were certain kings that were far more instrumental than others in expanding the borders of Assyria. You mentioned Sargon, but a predecessor but one to him, Tiglath-Pileser III, is generally accepted as probably being the greatest of all the Assyrian kings and one of the seminal figures of the ancient world, of the ancient Near East. And it was he who established the formal basis of the Assyrian Empire by translating many territories that the Assyrians had defeated and conquered from just being tribute-bearing states to becoming provinces. So under Tiglath-Pileser, you see the emergence of a whole series of provinces across Syria, down through the Levant, into the northern kingdom of Israel. Not all of Israel was conquered by Tiglath-Pileser. He certainly conquered the area of the Galilee, but his son didn't live for very long, and it is thought that his son, Shalmaneser, was a gentleman who first brought about the surrender of the northern capital of Samaria. Sargon II was a usurper, we think. Not maybe part of the main royal family, but he was a very, very effective soldier and was engaged on warfare for most of his life. And he and Tiglath-Pileser are responsible probably for the greatest territorial acquisitions that formed the Assyrian Empire. Sargon's son was Sennacherib, who we come across in Byron's poem. We come across in the Old Testament with the supposed siege of Jerusalem. After Sennacherib, you had Esarhaddon, who conquered Egypt. And after Esarhaddon, you have the one that probably most people know, Ashurbanipal, primarily because it was from his palace in Nineveh that an English gentleman, slipped my mind his name, Austin Layard, who excavated Nineveh, part of Nineveh, the great palace that Sennacherib had built. And he brought back lots and lots of wall reliefs from northern Iraq to London, and these are now seen in the British Museum. And it's the wall reliefs that depict the siege of Lachish that he brought back. We don't know exactly when Ashurbanipal died, but following his demise, you clearly get a period which sees the decline of the empire itself and finally its collapse.
So how often? Oh yeah, no, he's fine.
I was trying to find. I just I read a book about a month or two ago about the whole Mesopotamian area, and I was trying to find it. I can't even find it in all my books, but I wanted to ask you, and that'll be in one of my later questions. I wanted to ask you about some of the other campaigns that took place, because when I talk to you in a second, I want to ask you about. I have this book here, the Code of is it Hammurabi?
Yes.
Yeah, Hammurabi. So
he predates
predates
the Neo-Assyrian Empire by about 600-700 years.
Yeah, but yes. So when we get to my next question, I'm going to ask you a couple things about that.
All right. So it is now my question. So regarding these the kings, how often were they out on military campaigns, and how did those campaigns contribute to the Assyrian economy?
Good question. The most important kings were out on campaign almost annually. There were occasions when you had some kings who weren't so proficient in warfare, who weren't. But inasmuch as Assyria became a mighty and a very wealthy empire, it was on the basis of war. It just so happens that Assyria was underpinned by a religious ideology that supposedly their god, Ashur, Assyria being the empire of Ashur, that Ashur gave to the king of Assyria on his coronation the power to conquer all other lands. Not necessarily for the propagation of the Assyrian religion, because that didn't happen. The evidence is the Assyrians did not propagate their religion. So the reason why Assyria expanded its borders in the Neo-Assyrian period was to acquire territories that could yield tribute, that flowed to the center and made Assyria itself extremely rich. And that really, quite simply, is probably the basis for Assyrian imperialism, no matter how it was dressed up. It wasn't dressed up in ideological terms or religious terms, apart from the fact that Ashur empowered the king to spread the borders of Assyria. So it was, I think, an empire founded solely on conquest, and it became immensely rich on the basis of the wealth and tribute that flowed into Assyria from the areas it conquered. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And it's interesting that you answer it with Ashur and the divine. Well, I want to get into that. So your book discusses how the kings were divinely chosen to lead the Assyrians. How did the Assyrians view their kings? Did they view them as deities, or did they simply view them as a king by divine selection? And also, while I was reading your book, you have a lot of there are a lot of moments in time where, say, after a victorious battle, the king will give praise and glory to Asher or a certain god. Were they actually religiously devout, or were their writings about thanking God for the victory simply post-war propaganda?
No, I don't think that's a rationalization from our perspective. I think there is no way you can separate war in the ancient Near East, be it Assyrian, Babylonian, Hittite, Egyptian. You're going back some way now, obviously, with Hittites and Egyptians before the Assyrians. All war was sanctioned by the gods. War was a religious activity. So the notion that there was some sort of secular underpinning, which had grafted onto it some sort of religious ideology, I suggest, no, I don't think so. I think all the Assyrian kings accepted and believed that they were empowered to do what they did by the gods, and particularly the goddess Shur. Now, you ask about how did you become a king? Well, you on the whole became a king because you were the son of the king on the throne, but there wasn't primogeniture, that is, that the oldest son inherited. It was up to the king to designate, and whoever became chosen then was reinforced by the religious underpinning that he'd also been selected by Ashur to take his place as the crown prince. For example, Sennacherib originally chose his eldest son to be his heir designate, then changed his mind and selected his youngest son, Esarhaddon. So when Sennacherib was murdered in 681 by some of his sons, you had the makings of a civil war. So that did happen. But Esarhaddon managed to get back to Nineveh before the conspirators were able to place themselves and their regime on the throne and in the state before he got there. Tiglath-Pileser III, who I've mentioned already, became king of Assyria in 745. He is thought to have been a usurper. It's still the case that Assyriologists now try and work out, where did he come from? Was he a son, an older son in the royal family? Where did he come from? But clearly, he was a known quantity, and the then king, who was deemed to be too weak, seems to have been assassinated, and Tiglath-Pileser, who originally had the nickname Pul, was put on the throne, and then almost immediately started going to war and proving himself to be very successful general. So Assyria had problems with usurpers. Assyria had problems with revolts. There was one Assyrian king, Shalmaneser III, who in his dotage, in his old age, almost the whole country rose against him and his heir designate, and that heir designate had to fight to secure the throne. So Assyria had its fair share of problems. It wasn't unlike any other city-states, even though, they invoked the gods as being the justification for this, that, and the other. I'm trying not to get too complex.
Hey, it's a complex thing. It's an
It
empire.
is.
No doubt.
But all empires were sanctioned by religion. I mean, in that sense, the Hebrews/Jews were no different. Yeah. They went to war when Yahweh said so. The Babylonians went to war when their God said so. The Medes the same. Everybody did. Not only was war endemic at this time, and this is something which, if you don't mind, can I jump in here? Much is made of Assyrian accounts of the description of what we would nowadays call atrocities. I think what happened some 3 weeks ago with, and I'm not being political here, I'm just stating the facts I'm stating the information as I have heard it on the television and read it in the newspapers about the sorts of things that some of the Hamas people did when they attacked the kibbutzim in southern Israel. I mean, it was fairly barbaric, but it was barbaric along the lines of what ISIS carried out. The sort of barbarism the Assyrians describe was not unique to them. We know that there were cases of that sort carried out by the Egyptians when they had their empire. And I think it's worth saying this, if you don't mind me doing so. These accounts in cuneiform, which in some cases attended the wall reliefs, which show, for example, flayings and decapitations, were on the walls of the royal palaces. Now, the only people that would get to see these images were Assyrians themselves, high-ranking Assyrians, and people who came to court to see the Assyrian king, to be told what to do, officials from other territories within the empire. And although the wall reliefs were pretty graphic, and they were painted at the time, much in the way the Romans painted their statues, the Assyrians painted their wall reliefs. So there would have been lots of blood, etc., lots of decapitated heads. It was there on the walls to point out to them, this is what will happen to you if you do not do what you say, which is to obey the treaties that you have signed with us. So did Syrians engage in this sort of barbarity willy-nilly? No. Was it done to make a point? Yes. I mean, you have this expression. Sargon talks about pouring out terror. Terror is a deliberate policy. But you've had that in the 20th century. I forgot the German word for the policy that the German army used very early on in the First World War. Deliberate instilling of terror to deter those that you have captured or conquered from doing things against you. So I think we have to be I think personally, a little bit critical and about exactly how this was done.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think it was interesting that sometimes they would choose to completely destroy a city and sometimes preserve a city And at times it was for the same offense, which I found somewhat interesting that they, but like you said, it wasn't just willy nilly. They actually thought about these things for short term and long term purposes.
Well,
and also I think, you did have the personalities of the kings involved. Not all kings reacted the same way. Ashurnasirpal II is thought to have been a bit of a sadistic individual who actually decided to eliminate cities just for the sake of it. Why not? I don't mean why not in the sense of why not do it, but we have to understand that the Assyrians were as much humans as anybody else, and you had the sheer variety of human types that you had then as you do now.
You mentioned something about the flaying. Now, my mom's side of the family, they're Phoenician, and my father's side, they're Aramaic. So, and I don't know if it was the Assyrians, but I remember reading somewhere that there was a Phoenician king, I don't know if he was from Sidon or Tyre, who rebelled against one of the kings of Mesopotamia, and there's a picture of him, or a symbol of him being flayed. So when you mentioned that, I recalled reading about that, and I think I saw the picture of it. It was up on the reliefs. Now, and this is why I was looking for that other book, because I'm going to have to go by memory. So forgive me if I use the wrong words, but I remember there were all these various empires that arose in Mesopotamia. I want to say there was there was Uruk, the Elamites, you had the Babylonians, you had the Medes, you had the Hittites. I don't know when the Parthians showed up. I know there was a Parthian Empire later on. And I know because I know Cyrus, he came about in the 6th century BC. So I know this was prior, that was after Nineveh or Assyria was destroyed.
Yeah,
so
you had the Assyrian Empire collapses in 612 BC. The Babylonians then inherit, in effect, the Assyrian Empire for the next 100 years. 539, Cyrus takes Babylon, and you had the beginnings of the Achaemenid Persian Empire.
Say that again?
Achaemenid.
I was, okay. I heard you say Achaemenid, that's why. I was like, hey, that's me, because I can speak Arabic, and so that is a pronunciation that I don't hear too many people saying. So here's my question. When these various empires destroyed other empires, or the various empires that surrounded them, or the cities that surrounded them, I do recall, like, Babylon was once completely destroyed, but there was a symbol of a religious symbol that was taken out, and then the people would freak out, saying, "No, you're going to incur the wrath of the gods." So, and it was eventually given back. So there was constant warfare. I know Babylon was a constant thorn in the side of Assyria. You just mentioned about raising cities just for the sake of it. So would it have been best for the Assyrians in the long run to just completely raze, say, Babylon or any other city to the ground, and then just migrate some of their people to kind of take it over? I mean, how is it that all these different empires kept coming back? You know, it was a back and forth throughout the history of Mesopotamia until, I mean, even after, Alexander went through there, and then you still had. What was the thinking, knowing full well that sooner or later these folks are going to come back and get us? Maybe it might not be in 100 years, it might be in 500 years. Why not just completely genocide and take it over and migrate your people there? What's your thinking on that whole subject?
It's a pretty big subject.
Let's take Babylon, for instance.
I was going to say, let's take Babylon.
Okay.
The Assyrians had an ambivalent attitude to Babylon. The distance between Nineveh and Babylon was, I think, about 400 miles. So for us, it's the distance from the south coast of England to more or less the borders of Scotland. Not a great distance, not a great distance. They spoke basically the same language, Akkadian. They shared many of the same gods. Babylon was older. And the thing is, Babylon had a prestige that was recognized throughout the ancient Near East as one of the great centers of civilization and of religion, which tended to be one of the same thing. It also had a god, Marduk, that was venerated by many, many other peoples outside of Babylon. Now, Assyria came along, well, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which roughly covers the period the 9th to the 7th century BCE. It comes along later than certainly does Babylon. And the Assyrians venerated Babylon as well as a religious center. But when Assyria started expanding its borders, particularly under Tiglath-Pileser III, that's in the 8th century, he was the first Assyrian monarch to go into Babylonia and try and take it over, which he did. He, in fact, became king of Babylon before he died. The attraction of Babylon for him was that Babylon was the nexus at a very large number of international trade routes. You had boats coming in from India, from the Indus Valley into up the Tigris Euphrates, and actually docking at Babylon. You had trade routes coming in from Afghanistan, bringing things like lapis lazuli and gold, lead. You also had trade routes from southern Iran. You had trade routes coming out of Arabia. You had trade routes coming across from Egypt and the Levant. So Assyrian kings from Tiglath-Pileser III always had their eye on the main chance of increasing the wealth of Assyria through taxation and control of trade routes. There's always an underlying economic motive. In that sense, Marx was always right. It's economics that tend to determine how things evolve. Now, the Babylonians did not take the Babylonians were themselves ambivalent about the Assyrians. They saw the Assyrians as being helpful when the Babylonians could see that they were useful against tribes to the south of Babylon in the Great Marsh areas. You had the I've forgotten the names. You had two very large tribal groups who had settled in Babylonia and who, particularly those in the south, stuck their nose in Babylonian politics and business. And the Babylonians, being older, didn't like these Johnny-come-latelys sticking their noses in. And they were quite happy, say under Tiglath-Pileser III, to have the Assyrians come in, sort out these tribal groups, and permit Tiglath-Pileser to become king of Babylon. But it didn't last. They got sick. They wanted their independence. They didn't feel they wanted to be ruled by, in effect, people who were related to them in the north. The Babylonians were always very independent. And you got the outbreaks of wars between Assyria and the Babylonians. And because Babylon had become such a prestigious city and Babylonia was so important, the Assyrians were not prepared to sit back and see the Babylonians acquire their independence. Not only that, the Babylonians had got to the Assyrians had got to the point where they could simply not allow anyone who was included within their empire, who's linked to them by treaty, to go their own way and then see the rest of their empire not try and do the same. I think what is remarkable about the Assyrian Empire, and this must have come across, when you're reading my book, how many times the Assyrians found themselves refighting the same people. You mentioned this. No matter how horrific some of the barbarities inflicted on people who broke their agreements with Assyria, they still came back to try and regain their independence. So the Assyrians went back in again and sorted them out again, but it still wasn't enough. So the history of the Assyrian Empire seems to be victories followed by a degree of retrenchment, in which the natives then decide to raise the flag of revolt and try and gain their independence. One of the reasons why Tiglath-Pileser decided to translate tributary states into provinces, which would have had Assyrian troops permanently based in there to stop any uprisings of the sort that happened before the provincial system was introduced. I mean, what I wasn't able to put into the book, which I would have liked to have done, because you get limited by the number of maps the publishers prepared to allow you to use. It would have been a map of the ancient Near East when it was part of the Assyrian Empire, showing all the provinces. And the number of provinces that the Assyrians had by, say, the middle of the 7th century was very, very, very extensive. And there were Assyrian troops based in all these places. And they were there to scotch any attempt by the natives to rise up in revolt. And they tended by that time to succeed. But Babylonia was always a problem for the Assyrians. You know the expression Spain in Napoleon's empire, the Spanish boil, the Spanish abscess. You heard that expression?
Right.
You heard it?
Yeah.
Because he could never get Spain under control, and he had to send loads of troops down there. Same problem with Babylonia. Babylonia was Assyria's ulcer, its boil. Yeah. And perhaps all the campaigns that they fought in Babylonia, right through to the end of the empire, contributed in no small measure to its eventual decline because of the manpower losses. Yeah. Extensive manpower losses.
Yeah, and it's interesting, you've got that, 3,000 years later with the Napoleonic Wars, it's the same exact thing with Spain. The moment you think you might be getting some control, well, now you want to expand, or at least not expand, but go into Russia, and you pull out, tens of thousands of troops, and then you ultimately lose Spain, and then it doesn't help that Wellington is creeping in as well. So yeah, it doesn't change. Like the warfare, the methods of the warfare changes as far as like artillery, but the tactics, the strategies,
yes,
it's all the same. Yeah.
But doesn't it seem to make one point? Don't bother trying to create an empire because you'll lose it.
You can't own the world. That's right.
No. We came fairly close.
Right. Yeah. Sun never set.
Yeah, but we had to dump it pretty quickly after the Second World War.
Yeah.
You just couldn't afford to keep it.
Ultimately, it becomes untenable.
That's right.
It actually leads to my last question. Our last question is pretty simple, and you sort of touched on it, but I know in your book, it sort of leaves a question of how the hell did this happen, which is how did the Assyrian Empire come to an end?
Well, that's always been one of the great mysteries of history because it goes from a point in, say, 650 BC where it dominates most of the ancient Near East. And then in 612, it's gone. And nobody sheds a tear for its going. Now, the latest possible explanation, and I think in the light of other things that I brought up in my book, at the beginning, I talk about the great the famines brought about by the failure of the rains to fall. And you get that again in a much, much bigger way, it would seem, towards the end of the Assyrian Empire. Over a period of about 30 years, you have the beginnings of quite extensive desiccation. Now, all these economies in that part of the world were based upon agriculture. One of the reasons why the Assyrian Empire was able to expand and to take its armies abroad so much was that it harvested every year, certainly in the 2 centuries, the 9th to the 8th centuries BC, very, very large harvests. And like the Romans, Assyrian soldiers took campaign flour with them. And every year, the Assyrian kings would ask when the harvest was brought in, to what extent is it a good harvest? Because a good harvest guaranteed the ability of the Assyrian army to go on campaign. Now, what you've got, it would seem, from about 650 onwards, you get the beginnings of extensive desiccation in the climate. The rains don't fall, the crops don't grow. So you get a repetition of the terrible conditions that existed in northern Iraq in the 10th century BC. What is interesting is that you've got similar such conditions at the moment going on in Iraq. The river Euphrates has almost totally dried up. And that seems to be because of climatic problems in the northeast of the Mediterranean that flows across. It was a team from one of the universities in California who did extensive work on this, on caves in northern Iraq, who were able to identify these very extensive periods of climatic change, which led to a ceasing of the rain falling, therefore a ceasing of the grains growing. So harvests weren't brought in, and you could not support an army without the harvests. The other side of the coin is if people started dying off because of famine, many of the original Assyrian soldiers were farmers and farm laborers to begin with. Then once the harvest was brought in, bang, in the army. So the agricultural workers were, to begin with, also the soldiers. So I think you've got a compound of factors. I think undoubtedly there is evidence of a decline in the population of Assyria, such that the armies were no longer able to raise the number, the manpower they needed. That was compounded by the problems brought about by famine, desiccation of the climate, which caused the famine, and also because the Babylonians reasserted themselves. The first king of the new Babylonian dynasty was not actually a Babylonian. Nabopolassar was from one of the tribes to the south of Babylonia. His son became Nebuchadnezzar, the king who actually took Jerusalem the following century. But I think it's no one factor ever explains how an empire declines. You have a compounding of factors which together create situations which no one individual can actually hope to control.
Well, Mark, I think I can probably sum it up for you pretty easily, and I think I've come up with the conclusion. I think the Assyrians just made the gods angry, and that's it. And the gods said, "That's enough. We're moving on."
Yes, I mean,
why not?
I think, well, why not?
I have a question.
Basically, sorry, yeah, sure.
You kept mentioning about the climate change that took place. The collapse of the Bronze Age, or the late collapse of the Bronze Age, I think, which led to the Sea Peoples taking over. And was that part of?
Well, I think climate change was partly to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting. It seems to be emerging now. Historians in the past didn't consider factors like climate change as an explanatory factor for some of the problems they were seeking to account for. A very good book that's come out by an American historian about Rome. It's a new account of the fall of the Roman Empire. And his principal thesis is that disease and climate change were the two principal factors that contributed towards the decline of the Roman Empire over a long period of time. Successive climate change, which led to famines, which also led to the emergence of new diseases, which killed off large numbers of people progressively over time. So I think you're right. The Bronze Age collapse was certainly in part caused by climate change. I mean, the pressure of tribes moving into Greece, pushing out the original inhabitants of the Greek peninsula, who then moved into what we nowadays call Turkey, who then displaced and destroyed the Hittite Empire, moved south. Those that we call the Sea Peoples would seem to be genuinely people suffering from the same problems, but maybe from the Greek islands. And places, when Ramesses III ended up fighting them and defeating them on the borders of Egypt, they had come looking for new lands to settle. And the explanation there is thought to have been primarily climate change, bringing about very, very terrible living conditions, which if they were to survive, they had to move on and find pastures new. So I think this is something that probably, if I can just diverge, have I got time just to diverge slightly?
Yeah, go for it.
I teach history at something called U3A. I'm 70. U3A is the University of the Third Age. It was set up, I think, in Europe. It was for people who had retired, who wanted to keep their brains active, anti-Alzheimer's. And I taught history for 30 plus years. I was first published in 89. And the unit I was teaching last year was the world in the 17th century. Now, I based that upon a book by an English historian called Geoffrey Palmer, I think teaches in American University. The 17th century was probably the worst year across the world for climate change and the consequences that afflicted the countries all over the world. It afflicted Europe, it afflicted Africa, it afflicted the Middle East, it afflicted the Turkish Empire. It is now thought we can start dating the decline of the Turkish Empire to the consequences of the climatic problems brought about in the 17th century. And it goes into India, the only country that seems to have managed to, how would you say?
Is this the Little Ice Age?
Yes, but it's the consequences across the world. Almost a whole century. I mean, most people in this country don't know that the English Civil War, 1642, 1645, was fought in a period that was extremely wet and extremely cold, and that were quite a few famines. Talk about the battles. I mean, films of, English battles, the Civil War battle in Naseby, always filmed with blue skies and whatever. No, not at all, not at all. The only country in the world that seems to have managed to cope with the conditions was Japan. And that was because Japan was a highly centralized state in which the shogun gave the orders to the daimyo underneath him, and they did as they were told, feeding the people. But all over the rest of the world, the changes brought about by this climate change was incredible. China went through a hell of a period. Millions upon millions dying of starvation. Do we hear about this? No, because we tend to still see history in terms of our own national histories, whereas we ought to be looking really at a bigger global picture whenever we're looking at things.
Yeah.
So was the Assyrian Empire bound to fail? Yes, bound to fail. I mean, it was fighting almost. The Assyrian army was out on campaign virtually every year or every other year for nearly 3 centuries. No, no country can survive that sort of commitment.
I tell you what, Mark, that's no way to live. It's no
It
way to
isn't any
live.
way to live.
Yeah.
It isn't any way to live. War is not a good thing.
No, it sucks. It sucks
It
for
does
sure.
suck.
Yeah.
Now, gentlemen, I hope I've given you something that you were looking for. I'll be very disappointed if I haven't been able to give you something you were looking for.
No, you've given us more, at least from my perspective, more than what I was even expecting. It's been a fabulous conversation. So much to think about, but so much to, I guess, consume for our listeners. There's so much there, and your book. I wrote a review of the book. It came out, I guess, a number of days ago for the Epoch Times, but it is, I think, the perfect book to get you started as far as having an understanding of what the Assyrian Empire was all about. And like you said at the beginning of the show, your primary focus is on the kings and the armies, the military. But it gives you a very good grasp of what was going on for those several hundred years with the Assyrians. But yeah, no, I loved it. I loved it, Mark. It was such a pleasure having you.
Yeah, I could ask you several more questions, but I know we're
Oh yeah, no, I was looking at my notes from when I was reading the book, and I was like, man, I could ask 20 questions just writing them down and still have more left over.
I did want to ask real quick, did ISIS destroy anything of importance regarding Assyria archaeology or anything like that?
Yeah, they did. They blew up. I think it was they blew up large sections of the remains of the city of Nimrud. I think it was Nimrud, not Ashur, but Nimrud, which was a United Nations, heritage site. They were barbarians. They certainly blew up parts of the great palace, the palace without rivals in Nineveh, which was built by Sennacherib. They blew up wall reliefs. I have a book by one of your historians who worked extensively on the archaeology of Nineveh, and he calls it the final destruction of Nineveh, and it's to do with what ISIS did about it. They were. It is hard to imagine the mentality of those people. It is. It truly is. But having said that, we say that about the Syrians. How can people have thought that way? But you say that now. How can people think that way in 2023?
Well, I mean, it goes to the point with just war in general.
Yep.
Times change, people don't. Eh, very
No,
often.
that's the trouble. That's the trouble.
Yeah.
That's the trouble. As you said earlier, technology improves, tactics don't change that much, strategy doesn't change that much, people don't change that much.
Yeah, exactly.
God forbid.
It's
Yeah.
you got to stay on your toes. Well, Mark, thanks again for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah. Well, I hope that is the case, and thank you for the conversation.
Dustin, that was fantastic. The Assyrians, always one of my favorite subjects. There's not that much material out there on this very subject, so I'm glad we got to talk to somebody who knew his. Well, I was going to say know his, but know his stuff. Yeah, can we say that? Come on,
Shiz?
Shit. Who knows his shit?
Well, it's the end of the episode, so why not?
Yeah, that's right. Might
Yeah,
as
we
well.
won't have turned anybody off yet.
Yeah. So, there's the whole controversies about the Old Testament and the historical, information that's out there. I knew that the Old Testament had differences between the historical record and what it states. But overall, I mean, it's at least somewhat going to be correct. But he mentioned like the battle, the siege that he said didn't take place. There was I know that the angel of the Lord's not going to come and wipe out 100. I guess he said what 183,000.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're talking about completely wiping out an entire empire at that point. So
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's that's the thing. When he asked, like, is that how it's viewed? Because he was like, I assume that that's in America, like that's how it's viewed. I think that is the general accepted view, is to take it on its literal basis. And I think probably the reason the Bible, when it comes to the historical aspect or the historical retellings, taking it literally and to be completely accurate without, your typical bias or propaganda or anything like that, is is a generally accepted view, that you take it literally, and this is exactly how it is, and you. I think a lot of people, they're never pulling in other sources, other ancient sources to compare, right?
I don't
They're
think
just
people
they're.
take it literally.
I
I've
think
never.
I think people do.
Well, no,
Maybe
no, no. I
maybe
think some people do. I don't.
maybe
I
the
don't.
Catholics don't, but I think the evangelicals probably do.
Well, I don't believe that God made, Earth in 24-hour days. I think that they were. I think if anything, it was more of maybe they were 6 days for God. Let's just say. But what was a day? I don't think it was a 24-hour period. I think you're putting limitations on.
Well, I think when you get to that, you're starting to take the English translation into its literal form, instead of reading it in Hebrew or in Greek, where the definitions of those words are very different than a day. Because in English, a day is a 24-hour period. But even when we say a day and we think a 24-hour period, even in, Genesis 1, when they say a day, that just means when the sun is out. You know, so it's not even 24 hours. So I think, yeah, to that, I think those are two different literal interpretations. I think when we're talking about what happened in battle, what happened with, certain kings, I think the chronological, um, I think chronologically it lines up really well. But I also believe that, and this is from just studies of how things were written in the Old Testament, was, some of it was propaganda, some of it was hyperbole about what was going on, and like we ended up discussing, to make, the one party look better than the other party, and that's pretty much across the board, nation to nation, empire to empire. That's just what they did.
Yeah. Okay. Well.
And I think it's fair to say that the Jews were no different.
Well, in terms of like massacring people, or.
No, in terms of recalling their history or writing their history.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even if you do read their history, they did wipe out like the people of Jericho,
No,
and they
they're
wiped out
freaking, yeah.
different. There were a lot of cities that they just, where
Yeah,
they
they're
said
brutal.
God said wipe out everybody, including,
But like Mark said, everything, when it comes to war, it's not just war for war's sake. Religion and war go hand to hand. Gods and war, it's gods and generals, right? That all goes hand in hand. You're not going into battle without being told by the gods to go fight, or to ensure, like you can read all throughout the Old Testament where the king would say, hey, are we going to win this battle? I need to know. Can God tell us whether we're going to win or whether we're going to lose, what we should do? So,
yeah. No, that is true. I mean, even Alexander, he went to He even went to Egypt, I think, to speak to Ammon, one of the Egyptian gods, and get advice and, ask, you going to help me out here or what, And so.
Yeah. What's the, what's the place in ancient Greece?
Delphi.
I knew it started with a D. I just couldn't. Yeah.
That was the Temple of Apollo or something with Apollo. That was the Oracle. I don't know if it's the Oracle of Apollo, but Delphi was that was, if you saw the movie 300, when Leonidas went to go get advice, and that chick was like floating in the air with incense, and I think she was naked, wearing some sort of a sheet of some sort. But yeah, that was the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi.
That was a wild scene.
Yeah, it was a good movie. That was a good movie. I like that.
Yeah, it's a good movie. It's very cool. All right, man. Well, I enjoyed this one. This was a lot of fun, and I hope our listeners got a lot out of it.
Yeah, I hope so. It was a good conversation, and I hope he keeps writing.
Always good to have a Brit with
Yes.
us every once in a while.
My belief is if you want to have a conversation that sounds intellectual, just bring a Brit into it, and there you go. Have you know what? If you own a company and you want your company to look like they know what the hell they're talking about, or if you're a government agent, or if a president and you want your country to look intellectual, hire a Brit as your spokesman. Get rid of Kareem Jean-Pierre and bring in a Brit. I think
That would be a good idea.
Yeah. I'll tell you, if I was president, I'd hire a Brit to be UN ambassador.
Sure you would. Yeah, if we can only get you elected. All right, well, that's all I got. I had a joke, forgot it, and I will end it there. I'll see you later, man.
Take care, bud.